Good morning, everybody. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives at the Wilson Center. I'm delighted to be able to moderate this conversation today with four experts on the automotive industry, and in particular on US and Asian relations in the US, in the automotive sector. The title of today's event is EVs and Green Transport and the US-South Korean Partnership. And let me just lead off by saying that the past year has been celebrated by many as being full of legislative successes for the Biden administration in terms of strategic competition and competitiveness in general. We've had, of course, the CHIPS and Science Act, which was passed at the end of the summer. After that, we've had the Inflation Reduction Act with upwards of $400 billion in tax credits going to the electric vehicle sector. In addition to those two big legislative successes, in the area of critical minerals, we've seen the creation of the Mineral Security Partnership. We've also seen the use of the Defense Production Act to provide some subsidies for mineral production here in the United States. And in general, we've seen an approach by the Biden administration and the US Congress that has focused on strengthening the US automotive sector within the context of North America. And whilst that has been generally celebrated in many areas, we've now begun to see some of the unintended consequences of those legislative successes. We've seen negative reactions from a number of US allies, European and Asian allies. We've seen deep concerns about whether the United States is choosing to go it alone rather than working in collaboration with its partners, friends, and allies around the world. And recently we saw the term industrial policy FOMO, which I thought was a beautiful phrase, in terms of the European reaction to what is happening here in the United States. And the reason why I mentioned that is just simply because we do seem to be in the era now of industrial policy here in the United States. And it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out around the world. So with me today, I have, as I said, four great experts. It's a highly distinguished panel. First of all, delighted to introduce to you Mr. Ed Gresser, who is Vice President and Director for Trade and Global Markets at the Progressive Policy Institute. He's a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Trade Policy and Economics at USTR. Great to have you with us, Ed. Secondly, Mr. Robert Hood, Vice President of Government Affairs for Hyundai Motor Company. Thirdly, Ms. Tammy Overby, a Senior Advisor at Albright Stonebridge Group, former Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Lovely to see you, Tammy. And last but by no means least, Ms. Tori Smith, Director of International Economic Policy at the American Action Forum. Tori, thank you for joining us as well. I want to jump straight into the conversation, but before I do, let me just say to our audience here that there is the capacity to send in questions to our panelists through the Wilson Center website. So as you're watching this on the Wilson Center site, you'll see that there is a question box below. So please feel free to send in your questions. I'll be looking at that box. I'll take your questions and pass them on to the panelists. So beginning with you, Ed, you're a man who has a large amount of experience in terms of U.S. trade, in terms of economic policy here in the United States. It does seem as though we're in once again, it seems we're in an era where the United States decides to go it alone without necessarily consulting with its allies. There's a heavy focus right now on the strategic competition with China. And I'd love to get your reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act in particular, but also anything else that you'd like to mention in this regard, in terms of the advantages that the United States might perceive in terms of going it alone, working solo, versus cooperating with allies, and why international cooperation is in fact so important. Over to you, Ed.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me on this panel to the Wilson Center. I guess let me start with a short quote from yesterday. One of the administration's officials describing how, in the administration's view, they're proceeding. Then a little bit on the question of what does it mean to say the United States wants to do something? And then I'll talk a little bit about industrial policy and going it alone and cooperation and so forth. Yesterday at the WTO, the U.S. began its 3-year trade policy review, which is a WTO regular standing procedure through which all of the members, once every 3 years, stand up before the other 163 members, take in questions, respond to criticism, and so forth. So our ambassador, Maria Pagan, gave quite a fairly lengthy description of the administration's trade policy. It has a paragraph on electric vehicles as follows. In discussions regarding electric vehicle measures, the starting point should be the importance of working to achieve our overall climate supply chain and related goals in parallel, and to do so in a way that will have support from our stakeholders. This includes our shared goal in ensuring we achieve the Paris commitments, and assures the other members there will be the implementation of this is still in process, and there will be time to discuss and to make suggestions and so forth. Going back a few months to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it is not quite right to say the US is making choices. The administration placed quite a high priority in getting a major climate change bill through Congress. It did so in the context of a 50 Democratic votes in the Senate and no interest among the Republican Party in throwing some votes into the pool. And in those circumstances, the policy is often very, very heavily determined by the last one or two senators to go on board. So there's a lot of political economy and domestic politics behind this. And the outcome is the outcome of the political system, but it may not be the outcome that the US as a country would have chosen if it was, if we had a different sort of process to get here. Having said that, a couple of thoughts on industrial strategy, which, as you say, is quite in fashion here and elsewhere. And in the automotive world, the goal of the administration and the goal of a lot of countries and producers is to shift a very large industrial sector from a internal combustion system to a much less carbon intensive system. This is a really big job. Cars and trucks, as I understand it, account for about 22% of carbon emissions in the United States, a little bit less worldwide. In the US, there are about 16 million automobiles sold in a year, worldwide about 80 million. Electric and other low emission vehicles accounted for about 460,000 of these 16 million vehicles last year, and about 6.5 million worldwide, I believe. So you're taking a very complex industry that employs tens of millions of people and conducts well over $1 trillion in annual trade flows each year, and trying to shift it from one track to another. That probably does require pretty energetic policy measures, and the electric vehicle credit is one of a number of these things. How successful are these industrial strategy efforts? There are some recent examples that I think show that this can be done. It is not it's not an easy thing, but there are good examples to draw from. One I would draw your attention in particular to is the invention of mRNA vaccines in 2020 and their distribution worldwide in 2021. In this case, you have a quite new virus. You have some experience with different mRNA vaccines for different viruses, but from a standing start, basically, with a lot of government money and support, pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers and science labs and logistics companies were able within a year to develop a vaccine and within 2 years to vaccinate about 5 billion people. That was done without a lot of nationalism and localization and so forth. There was a very good study done by Chad Bowen of Peterson Institute looking at how complex the supply chains were that invented these things. I looked at the Moderna vaccine, US, Switzerland, Korea, Spain, France, Netherlands. AstraZeneca's 15 countries ranging from Thailand and Brazil to Japan and Italy in the United States, Switzerland. So here, the industrial strategy encouraged international cooperation, asked companies to go out, invent something, we'll put a lot of money into it, we won't tell you exactly how to do it, but come back quickly to us with the success story, and it more or less worked. The more you have a kind of localization policy, the more you are creating some trade-offs. It reduces the number of companies and experts that will be working on something, and makes it more likely that different countries will go in different directions. And that obviously raises some questions about how well the EV credit is going to work. And in addition to those that you mentioned about the unhappiness and uneasiness of American allies, the allies you mentioned include all of the countries with major indigenous automobile industries. And so it does create a kind of risk, one, that there'll be backlash against the United States, but also that different countries and different companies will go in different directions and wind up with a series of not very compatible new systems, rather than a relatively more efficient movement worldwide to a lower emissions industry. That in turn means probably higher prices for car buyers and less interest among consumers in picking them up. So there is a cost, both to the policy goal in taking an approach that is more nationalistic, and obviously there are international questions as well. So let me, I guess as a last point, say, nonetheless, this is a large and ambitious program in the United States. I think Ambassador Pagan is serious and in good faith, saying this is a big effort the United States is taking to move ourselves towards a more emissions efficient system. And over the next few weeks, the Treasury Department, I believe, will be finishing its regulations. There are a lot of questions about how exactly the credit will be implemented, what the accompanying commercial leasing credit will look like, and whether that presents a significant alternative to consumers as well as to more traditional commercial leasing clients. And with that, I hope we've done a little bit to set the groundwork, and back to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Ed. That's actually very helpful to us. And I mean, you talked about trade-offs there in your comments, and I think that's very much the way that we have to see this. But I also feel that, over the past few weeks in particular, we've seen some quite important advances in terms of the reactions of European and Asian allies and partners of the United States. This is quite a dynamic situation. And when you put the emphasis there on the transition to a sort of post-carbon future, some of the reactions have been to say, okay, look, the United States is doing this, so we actually have to do this too, which means that we're going to accelerate our transition. But there's no doubt that there have been at least, negative spillovers, unintended consequences for a number of actors. And with this, I'd love to turn to Robert right now and to talk about, how this has been perceived within the industry and how the industry is reacting to really the implementation of industrial policy, the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States. Over to you, Rob.
Great. Duncan, thank you. It's great to be with this panel again. I hope you guys can hear me okay. So just again, great to be with you guys. We had a great session just a month or so ago, but a lot has changed in terms of politics. As we wind down, right, there's always a clock ticking policy towards the end of this year with Treasury regulation, whether or not there'd be legislative action to take this. But I think I'd first take with an industrial policy. Is that counter to consumer policy, right? So we're trying to impose now an industrial policy that might come at the expense of the consumer. That gets into the Inflation Reduction Act and what it's doing. The core principle was to accelerate this transition to zero emission vehicles. And I think for the most part, the auto industry is on board. We all had our call with the White House back in early 2021 with this administration. And I think for the most part, everybody raised their hands and said, we're in. We want to be a part of the solution for the our company took it particularly serious. We not only developed new products, bringing more electric vehicles and as well as fuel cell vehicles to the market. We made a decision to build some of those vehicles right here in the United States. Announced a $5.5 billion investment to build a plant in the state of Georgia that will build strictly EVs, build the batteries as well. And just last week, we announced additional investment with a fellow Korean company, SK, to look to build additional batteries as we look to transition our existing plants that are building ICE, internal combustion vehicles, gas-powered vehicles, if you will. Start the transition of those lines, start building. In fact, at the end of this month, we plan to roll off our very first EV built in the United States out of our plant in Alabama. So that'll be the Genesis GV70. So for those of you looking for a luxury battery SUV, give me a call. That'll be available at the beginning of the new year. But again, getting back to this policy, if the intent was to drive the consumer, which is also the same person as the voter in the United States, make this change in technology, right? That's what this is really asking people to do, is give up basically a product that they've known now for over 100 years to something a little different. I would say a little better, certainly better for the environment. Tax incentives and other things probably need to be in place to help them make that decision. Purchasing a vehicle for most families is a pretty big deal, right? It is a large financial obligation for most people that they take very seriously. Most customers tend to be very savvy shoppers, looking to get the best deal they can for the money that they have. And unfortunately, the IRA sort of picks winners and losers. It takes away customer choice for folks. And that's where, our company, and I think it's safe to say many other companies have raised some concerns. Again, not with the overall arching premise of the IRA, which is to address climate change, but in the details here. And for us, the final assembly in North America on an act. So what that means is when the president signed this bill back in the middle of August, this went into effect. And for us and the company, we all had to reach out to all our dealer network, process over 800 dealers in the States to make sure that they weren't giving out false information to the consumers that are purchasing these cars. Because the last thing we want is for one of our customers to buy an electric vehicle, file their tax returns next year, thinking they're going to get a tax credit when in fact they bought the car after August 18th, and so no longer are they going to get the tax credit. And as we fast forward to Treasury producing the rules for the IRA, some of those rules started to come out this week. We're looking at a very complicated. I think that's, again, where we have great concerns. Consumer is now faced to sort out all these things. Is their income level too high or just right? In some cases, it might be too low. If you don't have basically filing an income tax, basically having a return, again, might not qualify. Is the vehicle price just right? You have to fit within sort of what we call the MSRP cap. So that's another dilemma. Was a car assembled in the United States? Or actually, say not the United States. The bill actually says North America, so it includes Canada, but then not our partners, other allied partners. So again, free trade agreement with Korea was not taken into consideration, or the vast importance of our European, allies, what it means for them. And of course, we've seen all that play out just in the last couple of weeks with France and Germany and the EU really getting quite vocal. And so we'll continue to monitor that, see if there's something that the administration can do to help alleviate some of these concerns. Again, back to Hyundai, just to be specific for us, we announced this investment in Georgia. It's going to employ 8,000 U.S. workers. Yet, you can't build a factory overnight. So we have cleared the ground. We've had the groundbreaking to include members from the Biden administration. We're kind enough to join us. The groundbreaking, along with our congressional delegation, and yet you can't build a factory, in a day or two, right? So we are doing everything we can to accelerate the construction of the facility, but we're still looking at probably sometime in the middle of 2025. So over the next few years, our customers will not have access to this tax incentive, and it has real world economic issues. We were basically number 2 in EV sales behind Tesla just a month ago. We have now lost that, and we will unfortunately, fall further behind as our competitors can offer the tax incentive to their customers, which is quite generous. Most shoppers are pretty savvy, looking for the best deal for their family. And the economic issue for us is that plant was designed to produce 300,000 cars a year, EVs. And if we're not growing our sales to get to that number, it really calls into question the economic model of whether or not that was a smart investment. I would argue that going back to the industrial policy, the whole intent was to get more investment in the U.S., create more jobs, bring more wealth to the U.S. This is a signal that's now sending around the world that maybe this isn't the place. I would argue by making it North America, maybe companies might look at Mexico or Canada for their investment. Certainly Mexico seems to be very popular with lots of other car companies. So again, just lots of mixed signals in this bill, and I've rambled on really long, so I'll stop there. But just note that we believe, particularly the final assembly in North America, some of these battery requirements, which we'll get into in a little bit, are so complicated that it is fortunately going to slow this important transition down. Worse, probably start to make it more. That's something that I think is really counter to what the administration is hoping for, which we call democratizing. How do we make it more affordable for the average family to, again, get out of their gas car into an EV, and by shrinking that supply chain, restricting where those parts and pieces can come from, if you will. Unfortunately, I'm afraid it's probably going to drive the cost up, not down. Again, that puts the consumer as sort of the loser here, and that's why I think this industrial policy is versus consumer policy. We're going from a kind of consumer-driven economy now to one sort of old-fashioned industrial policy, and we can get into discussion of where are you going to find the workers for this industrial policy. But I can tell you that is our biggest challenge with this facility in Georgia: is not building it, it's not running it, it's staff. It's the biggest challenge going forward, is finding those 8,000 Americans willing to come work in the plant. So I'll leave it there and happy to answer more questions.
Thank you, Robert. Your audio is a little bit choppy. We were able to hear you, but I'm going to ask you to work with the AV team right now to see if we can fix that before you come back for the next comments. But thank you. And I was able to hear and understand what you were saying. This is not the first time that the United States has acted on economic policy alone. This is not the first time that the United States has developed or acted in an economic nationalist way. From my graduate studies, I remember looking at the end of the Bretton Woods era in 1971, the Nixon administration basically deciding to end dollar convertibility into gold without even telling the Allies. Think about things like the Saturday Night Special, the dramatic raising of interest rates. Even in terms of the recurring issue of steel subsidies here in the United States and protectionism, which has been in the papers once again recently. Tammy, I want to turn to you. I know that recently you've been on a trip to Korea. I'd love to hear about the reactions to the Inflation Reduction Act that you heard over there, and whether or not this is truly a surprise in terms of the United States acting as somewhat of a rogue state in economic policy, or whether or not allies sort of say, well, it's the US, that's what they do, and we have to adjust. Because I think that this is, as I said earlier on, this is a dynamic situation. Things are changing. We're seeing more and more press coverage on this issue of how harmful this has been to allies. and we're seeing moves, that could actually be counterproductive for the United States. So, Tammy, reactions from Asia, if you don't mind.
Sure. And thanks, Duncan. We appreciate the opportunity to get the band back together to talk about this still very evolving issue. I would say that in every boardroom in Korea, they're watching how the U.S. treats this IRA issue with not just Hyundai and Kia, but also the battery companies. So all industry is watching to get an indication of does the U.S. really want more significant Korean investment? And my early indications are yes, the U.S. does. Everyone from President Biden to earlier this week, we had Undersecretary of State Jose Fernandez hosting the annual Senior Economic Dialogue with his Korean counterpart here in Washington. And even National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, excuse me, on a panel December 1st talking about the IRA. And everyone's saying the right things, that they want to find, Jake Sullivan said, we want to find a win-win solution. And frankly, Mr. Sullivan's comments were the most encouraging to date, because he said, and I quote, that he believes there are ways for us within the context of the law as it's written to ensure that this is a win-win and not a zero-sum game, end quote. So clearly the U.S. understands that the reaction of not just Korea, but the Japanese and the Europeans, that, they're taking it very seriously. And as I pointed out at the start, Korea Inc. is watching this closely. But I think the U.S. government is taking it very seriously, and we're hopeful that we can find an equitable solution. I will say that when I was in Seoul a couple of weeks ago and having a lunch with a CEO of a company that owns a major Korean battery company, he told me a story of how his company had invested in lithium mines in Argentina and nickel mines in Indonesia with the plan of using those critical minerals, those inputs for ultimate sale for batteries in the U.S. As the IRA is written right now, they can't do that. The elements, as I understand it, have to be secured from an FTA partner country. While Korea is a partner country, Argentina and Indonesia are not. So he said, my board, frankly, is looking at unwinding these investments because we can't use the minerals for the purpose that we bought them for, the investments for. So, Tammy, who do you think is going to buy these mines, these shares in mines? And he said, I'm afraid it's going to be the Chinese. And, they're the ones with the most money right now. They're trying to, lock down every critical mineral around the world they can. And I really don't think this is the goal of the administration. So again, more unintended consequences. But I am encouraged that I believe everyone from President Biden on down has gotten the memo, not just from the Koreans, the Japanese, but even President Macron mentioned it. So clearly everyone is aware that this needs to be addressed. I'll leave it to the experts on how it's going to be addressed, but it is, again, I'll reiterate and underscore that Korea Inc. is watching this closely. We've seen an explosion to the amount of tens of billions of dollars coming into the U.S. Korea Inc. is all in on investing in the U.S. right now for a variety of reasons. But they are watching closely to see how this particular issue is handled. And with that, Duncan, I'll stop and kick it back over to you.
That's great, Tammy. Thank you so much. This is, a developing situation. I'm really glad that since the last time that this this group assembled and we talked about this, there has been some positive progress in terms of the US reaction, a willingness to work with allies, a willingness to be more flexible. And, in this case, certainly there does seem to be an attitude, which is that, look, we want this to work. We want this to actually serve the dual purpose. And the dual purpose is we want to be able to make the transition to electric vehicles to decarbonize the automotive sector. And we also want to be able to compete with China. And you made that very clear in your comments, which is that one of the negative unintended consequences of this is that ultimately we may see divestment by Western firms from the critical minerals industry. And that will just open up even more space for the Chinese to get involved. And so we have to look at this not in isolation, but actually as part of the overall question of strategic competition between the United States and China, and how the United States works with its allies to actually move ahead. Tori, coming to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the sort of expected next moves are. And again, since the last time that we spoke, of course, things have moved, and so your question will be, your answer will be quite different since the last time that we had this conversation. But how do you see this playing out in the near future?
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. And thank you so much again to the Wilson Center for having me. I was really happy to hear Tammy's more positive outlook this time, because I feel like last time this conversation was really negative. I hope that I can take on some of that positivity, because while I agree that, the administration has certainly been more vocal in wanting to find a solution, I'm not quite as optimistic that a solution is possible, or a solution that everyone will be happy with is possible. And then moreover from that, a solution is possible that's actually going to help the administration achieve this goal, which is electrification. I think Ed hit on it a little bit, and so did Rob, but I think it's important to take back and to remember that, we're talking about wanting to reduce carbon emissions and doing that through electrification. So from a pure economic perspective, as Ed very eloquently laid out, that means you need to, if you're going to have a tax credit, it needs to be as broad-based as possible. And I would take that one step further and say that it also needs to allow for companies who are producing vehicles to focus on more than just one solution to the problem, more than just one way of having cleaner vehicles. And so there are many incentives that I think are affecting the ultimate goal and resulting in this legislation having very competing goals, not just on how you get to electrification, but also on, okay, are we focused on getting, clean vehicles in people's garages, or are we focused on competing with China? And sometimes these things come to a head. So I want to hit really quickly again on what this means for trade policy, because yes, the administration is trying to find ways through the regulations to try to make this work, to try to ease the tensions with our allies. But at the end of the day, I don't think that should discount the fact that our allies are completely justified in their animosity towards the Inflation Reduction Act. It is blatantly in violation of the WTO. It's blatantly in violation of an underpinning of a key tenet of the WTO, which is national treatment, and essentially means that imports cannot be treated differently than domestically produced goods, especially in the area of regulations. It also violates a core tenet of the US-Korea FTA of KORUS. And so if we come to a situation where a resolution is not found that is satisfactory to, as Tammy would put it, Korea Inc., then I think it would be completely justified and actually potentially quite successful for Korea to file a case under KORUS and contest these rules, because they are in blatant violation. And I think even if there is some adjustment to the rules, the final assembly rule alone, which only looks at goods or cars that qualify are from North America, that in and of itself violates national treatment. And those regulations, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, are kind of finalized, unless we have legislation to change the law, which at this point looks like maybe Senator Warnock's bill would just kind of push it off a couple of years and not actually change the fundamental underlying portion of the law that violates our international agreements. So I think moving forward, I am hopeful that the Treasury Department and the IRS can be creative with propagating these rules. There's been some talk about expanding the definition of trade agreement, potentially to encompass other types of agreements, because it's happening through Treasury and the IRS and not Commerce or the ITC. Treasury, so far as I know, doesn't have a definition within the agency for trade agreement like, say, USTR does. So could be more flexibility. At the same time, though, these agencies are very inexperienced with propagating rules of this particular kind. So what I think mostly requires is robust interagency cooperation. Treasury and the IRS need to be talking specifically with Commerce and the Bureau of Industry and Security on ways they can be propagating these rules so that it can expand the scope in a way that still is in accordance with the law. Because otherwise it's going to be quite difficult, I think, to have a solution that is satisfactory, and that moreover than Korea being satisfied, that doesn't violate our trade commitments. That is the biggest tension, I think, because I think you could potentially satisfy our allies while still being in violation of our commitments, but it could be seen as the better of two evils. And I'll sort of leave it there.
I really appreciate your comments, Tori. I mean, you've brought us sort of back up to the big picture here, which is really a question about whether we're in a post-free trade era, whether we have begun to redefine globalization, whether we're in a minilateral rather than a multilateral world, and certainly whether or not we are going to see ongoing respect for international trade law. The WTO has been in trouble for a long, long time. This week, of course, we saw that the United States basically just thumbed its nose at the WTO in terms of steel tariffs. And this is something which extends across administrations now. A lot of people point to the Trump administration, but it has certainly been continued by the Biden administration. A quick follow-up question for you, Tori, and then I want to go to some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. So please continue to send in your questions through the chat function on the webpage. But Tori, I mean, it's a big question, I know, but how do you see the development right now of the international trading regime? Are we going to see that ultimately it's unsustainable, that we're going to begin to see it fall apart, and we're going to move really to, regional trade agreements and friend shoring, ally shoring, trading with our friends, not with our rivals?
That's a really good question, Duncan. And I was actually just on, before this, I was just on a call that is a global trade coalition call where it brings together folks from the US and from Europe to talk about how we can advance free trade. And one of the things that always strikes me when I'm in those conversations is how much the US has just fallen to the wayside on leadership in this area. Because when you talk to partners in other parts of the world, especially in Europe and especially in the UK, that passion for the rules-based trading system, that commitment to that system is held much more strongly, in my opinion, than it is here amongst our policymakers and our government. And I find that to be very troubling because if you remember, the WTO and the rules-based trading system, the US was a primary architect of that system. And so with our absence, it creates a hole for other countries to come in and influence those rules. Very similar, I think, to Tammy's talk about what would happen with these lithium and nickel mines in different parts of the world that these Korean companies have invested in. Somebody fills that space. And if we pull back from that space, we hope that our other Western allies are the ones that fill that space. But the next biggest economy is China. And of course, that brings to mind, the juxtaposition between RCEP and the CPTPP, right? In terms of who's running and who's setting the rules for trade. I hope that the US is not completely backing down. The trend, I think I would agree with you, even going back to the Obama administration and the blocking of WTO appellate judges, it goes all the way back to the Obama administration. I would hope that this trend can change, can get back to what we know works for prosperity, what we know works for growth, what we know works for the American people in terms of their overall well-being and for citizens all around the world. But it's troubling, and the trend in the US is not good. And EV tax credits is just one of the latest problems. You have the 232 tariffs, you have the China 301 tariffs. Now potentially, I've been hearing rumblings of a 232 on carbon intensive goods in the US could be very, very soon coming across our desks. So the trend is not good in the US, and I hope that it does continue I hope it gets better.
Thank you, Tori. It's important to remember that, as you said, the United States was the architect, or one of the main architects of the rules of international trade, and that was for a reason. I mean, the purpose there was initially to help the Allies recover after the destruction of World War II, but secondly, to actually stabilize the system and to make sure that the system reflected United States interests and United States values. And it's not to say that is set in stone. That can be changed and altered over time, as it has been. But that change won't happen unless the United States plays a leadership role. And I think that's what we're all trying to see here, which is rather than the United States just acting alone, it actually does play the role of a leader, consulting with allies and partners and saying, how do we create a new system which actually reflects the values and the priorities of today? I'm going to move over right now to the questions that we're beginning to get from the audience. So please, if you have more questions, please put them into the chat box there. I've got the first one here, which has come in from Doug Palmer, who's a reporter for Politico. And this is for you, Rob. You talked about the difficult situation the tax credit has put Hyundai in regarding its investment in Georgia. Is there any chance that Hyundai would cancel that investment at this point or dramatically scale it back?
Great. Thanks, Duncan. And Doug, thanks for the question. Hopefully you can hear me better. I put on a headset, so I'm feeling very Korean now with my headset on. Just hope it doesn't mess up my hair. So with that, that's a really great question. It's a tough question. We certainly have looked at options as the IRA came to light at the end of July, sort of early August, and we really began to get into this language that I think surprised many people. It was very different than the Build Back Better version, which was sort of the predecessor to the IRA, if you will. It had in its language basically a final assembly in the US, but it gave you, I believe it was a 5-year transition period. And that's really, as a company, all we're really asking for is a transition period. I know Tori talked about, getting into the rules-based, sort of trade, global, lots of questions of where does that go, right? You can look at USMCA. There's a fight on, sort of a provision of that between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, and whether or not the US will respond. But back to this question, we were already well on the path for this facility in Georgia. The US is such an important market for our company. And we have made those commitments in Georgia, and I would argue we probably doubled down, sort of at our own political expense to a degree, right? So despite these policies hurting us, we're continuing to move forward with this investment, and of course announcing one with SK On just last week, and so on. But yeah, I think that still remains a economic decision that our company will have to continue to monitor. As I think I noted, we have to grow our market share and our market sales of our EVs year over year to sort of time with when this plant will come online. And if those sales really don't start to pick up and move, and it will really begin to question whether or not this plant can be economically feasible. And with this plant, we're under an agreement with the state of Georgia, which was a great place to do business. They've made a tremendously powerful incentive proposal to the company. But with that comes legal obligations on our part now, or contractual obligations, employment numbers, volume throughput, and so on. And if we begin to look at, and there are penalties if we don't meet those numbers. And so if this market, if this continues to potentially hurt our growth, I think we'll have no choice but to really reassess where we go. We don't want to do that. The U.S. is so important to us as a company. Our plants, the Kia plant in Georgia, the Hyundai plant in Montgomery, Alabama, have been super successful. And I think just to note that probably, I think the numbers would show that more than half of the automotive workforce in the United States work for an international company. Those are thousands and thousands and thousands of U.S. jobs working for companies like ours or others from around the globe. And again, it's our hope that there is some sort of solution at the end of this process. I'm not quite sure kind of what the administration will look to find in terms of a solution to it, but they certainly recognize the issue. We've had meetings with many senior officials in the administration as well as Congress, and I think they're all very sympathetic to the struggle. It's just finding that elusive thing that will help get us over the hump. And again, for us, it's slightly different than the Europeans. The Europeans are making more of an industrial policy argument. In our case, we've already made the decision to invest in the U.S. We're already here. We've already cleared ground. We've broken ground. We're moving out. And all we're asking is, don't penalize us for doing what you wanted us to do. We just can't do it as fast as basically the ink drying on the bill when the president signed it. And that's the rub. And for us, we just want to say, give us a fair opportunity over the next couple of years. And once that plant comes online, we'll be assembling cars in I would say America, not North America, but the law would allow us to go to Mexico or Canada. And back to the original question, we'll just have to wait and see how the economic modeling looks. Certainly Mexico is economically I wouldn't say cheaper, but it is certainly the price and the cost of labor and production and everything else is substantially cheaper in Mexico. Whether or not the company decides to revisit that, we'll have to see. As an American, I hope not. I'm pretty excited. And as a Georgian, I'm super excited about our presence in my home state. But we need the administration to help us find an equitable way to work our way through it. And I will tell you just maybe last thing, Duncan, as we talked a little bit, and Tori was mentioning, Treasury's issued some of their rules. We expect maybe some more rules and guidance to come out maybe today or tomorrow, and then surely by the end of. But the worst case will be is if they delay the battery rules, but implement all the other things in the bill, be it MSRP cap, income caps, for the final assembly, obviously, but then lift the overall cap that was in place in the previous legislation. That's going to create such an economic disadvantage for many of us that our hope is that Treasury would not do that and try to keep all of this. If there needs to be a delay everything. If they're not willing to do that, then they probably need to issue all those rules, because we need to understand those battery rules, particularly as we try to redesign our supply chain. That's a monumental task. And it's, the sooner we understand what those rules are going to be, the sooner we can begin to understand where do we need to make changes, because it's a global supply chain, right? It's not something you can just change tomorrow. And again, if they wait too long, it's particularly for us, because we're building not only the EV plant, but we're building a battery facility, 2 of them actually now, in the state of Georgia, and we need to know what the rules are so we make sure that we design and build that plant to be compliant. So we need those rules quickly, and that's our hope. But again, we're still hoping for a Hail Mary here before the end of the year.
Thanks, Rob. Just a quick note here. We heard the at least the rumors this week that Tesla is considering opening up a plant in Mexico as well, to take advantage of the North American component there. That may be, certainly one of the long-term effects of this. Tori, I know that you have a comment on this, but I'm going to throw in another question as well. So feel free to add to Rob's comments, and then if you could take a first crack at this question, which is coming from Mara Lee, who's a reporter for International Trade Today. Why is a final assembly rule for North America and requirements for battery components from North America different from USMCA tariff benefits? European and Japanese cars face a 2.5% tariff. Canada, Mexico don't if they meet the rules of origin requirements. Over to you.
Perfect. Okay, that's actually a really easy question to answer, but super quick on what Rob was talking about. We had very similar discussions to what he was laying out when we were going through the rules of origin in the USMCA, because the debate was, okay, is it going to be more cost effective in terms of the price of the end product to comply with these rules of origin, which got ratcheted up very substantially in the USMCA versus NAFTA? Or is it more affordable for these companies to just go on with their current supply chains and produce cars that are, more affordable for consumers that way? I don't necessarily think that that is maybe where the industry is right now, but it's certainly, I would imagine, if I had to guess, playing into some of the calculus and the economic models. Because while we're not talking about tariff rates here with this, what we are talking about are these regulations are going to make it more expensive to produce electric vehicles. And at the end of the day, will that expense added keep those vehicles underneath the income thresholds that exist within the law as well? Those MSRP thresholds that that Rob was talking about. I don't know, but it's very possible that the calculus could get to a point where you're like, well, if we want to make it so people can actually afford to buy these vehicles, it might not even be worth complying with some of these battery components anyways. So that's that. The second question, which I said is very easy to answer, Mara, so I appreciate it. And I know it can be a bit confusing. So because USMCA and predating that NAFTA, rules of origin are established under a free trade agreement. And under the WTO, you're allowed to have rules of origin within that trade agreement, so long as the agreement is covering, I think the technical phrase is substantially all trade. So because of that, those rules are permitted under the free trade agreement. However, if a country unilaterally creates these regulations not under a free trade agreement, then that is something that is seen as violating national treatment. So it's a little bit, it seems like, well, why aren't these the same thing? But technically speaking, one does violate those international commitments, the other one doesn't.
Thanks, Tori. And just a little note on that. From my years studying Mexico, a lot of companies, either in the automotive sector or outside, sometimes choose to pay the WTO tariff anyway, rather than go through the highly burdensome bureaucracy of filling out all the paperwork to actually qualify for rules of origin. So depending on what the price differential is in terms of production cost, then they may actually be able to get away with that. And that's something that we see sort of playing out in an interesting way. We have one last question from the audience before I turn to everybody for closing comments. And it's a nice one. It's less about Korea. This is actually about the European Union. Isn't there a bit of hypocrisy on the part of the Europeans in their IRA response? They have a lot of protectionist policies defined broadly that protect and support their industries. The auto tariff is one example. And that question is anonymous. So I guess that person just doesn't want to be barred from Europe anytime soon. So anyway, who would like to take a crack at that? Tammy, Kari, Ed, go ahead, please.
World of trade policy is not free of hypocrisy. Not free here, not free in quite a lot of places. Europe does have a significantly higher MFN tariff on cars than we do. That is a WTO bound tariff, so it's not quite the same as the thing they're complaining about. They frequently introduce lots of digital policies that are kind of designed to get at one of America's big advantages. So there's a lot of room for Americans to complain, and sometimes quite justifiable. Everyone should do the best they can.
I'll just add a little bit in here too, Duncan, if that's okay. Absolutely correct. There's so much hypocrisy, and many countries violate the rules. US has been doing it very blatantly for years now, as does China, as does Europe. But I think that this actually underpins our previous conversation about the importance of the rules-based trading system, because without a functioning World Trade Organization, without a functioning dispute settlement system, it makes it much more difficult to hold each other accountable for these violations. And without a functioning negotiation process at the WTO, it makes it much more difficult to create new rules to handle new problems that we're seeing emerge, especially in the area of industrial subsidies. So this just makes it so much more important that we need a functioning world trade system.
Thank you, Tori. I'm going to make one quick comment, and then I'll get closing comments from everybody else. Just on the subject of a liberal international rules-based trade order. One of the things that we see there is that ultimately it comes down to whether or not countries are willing to make the sometimes difficult decisions to invest in the factors that will make them competitive. And so those are often difficult decisions to be made. And you can, of course, be competitive if you invest in human capital, which has been mentioned here today, if you invest in infrastructure, if you invest in research and design. And that's one of the things that I think we have to face up to here in the United States as well, which is that this is not just about changing the rules. You actually do have to make your economy competitive, because otherwise, ultimately, the consumer will suffer and business will suffer in the long term. Closing comments from everybody. I'm going to go in the order in which we began this. So beginning with you, Ed, and it's a very simple question I'm going to put you. So in one line or two, are you optimistic about how this is going to turn out, and why?
I'd say I'm guardedly optimistic. This is, as several of us have mentioned, over the past few weeks, the Biden administration, from the president personally down to the ambassador in Geneva and so forth, have been saying the intention of the administration was not to cause friction and stress with allies. It is to, in good faith, try to move the industry toward a zero emission or low emission program. They have made done a lot of contacts with the governments. It isn't an easy thing, but I think they are very much aware of the dissatisfaction of other countries and are trying to find a way through. I would also, if I can add one line, there's been from you and from Tori and from others, important question raised about whether the U.S. is at all interested in open trade and free flows of goods and so forth. And I would say it is important to look at areas of stress and policies that one might disagree with. And is this, how do we interpret reaction to WTO's steel and aluminum decision? It's also important to note that we are in the midst of an extraordinary import boom. We will probably see $500 billion in import growth this year. We have seen in Korea going from 70 billion to 120 billion in imports. So it is not at all the case that in some very large way, the US is closing the doors. And we ought to be aware of that when we think about particular policies that we might disagree with.
Thank you, Ed. Same question for you, Rob. Optimistic, pessimistic, and what?
Oh, I think I'm a born optimist. So, I always, who wants to be a pessimist? That's no way to go through life. But I do have concerns, right? And I think, if we can't find a solution before the end of this year, or based on how Treasury puts out their regs, that could certainly complicate things my company, right? In terms of, again, we were on a high. We have, the world car of the year when it comes to our EV. We got new EVs rolling out literally next year. We're all in on this fight to attack the climate crisis. So without a doubt, we're moving down that path regardless. Will it be painful? Yeah, I think that's my fear. Is it will this potentially, put us in a really economically challenging position of building a facility that then the demand is not there? That would be devastating. But I'm optimistic. We didn't talk about sort of the next to the IRA. Prior to that was the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was also equally important in terms of transitioning to EVs, because our customers tell us one of their biggest hesitancies in buying an EV is the lack of infrastructure. That they don't want to be stranded, that range anxiety. And I think this administration is really working to try to address that. That will help consumers come on board. We look to hydrogen potentially as the next piece to this puzzle, and I think there's some growing interest from the Department of Energy on that front. So there are other exciting things that I'm optimistic about that maybe help us kind of manage our way through this. But we are hopeful. We have certainly, again, gotten very positive response from the administration of trying to find a solution to this. And so based on their comments to us in personal meetings, I'm going to remain optimistic, and we'll go from there. But at the end of the day, I think this is all about the consumers, and I just hope we don't forget, we can't make this shift if the consumers aren't with us. We need those consumers, and I remind our political friends, my consumer is their voter. It's the same person. So let's try to help them out.
Thank you, Robert. We're at time, but Tammy, quick comments at the end here.
Absolutely. I'm an optimist as well. My reason for being so is that there's so much at stake, both in the transition to electrification, but also it's so important perceptions in Korea among the business community. We want to see these billions of dollars of high-paying jobs continue to come to America. In order to do that, we've got to do the right thing here. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Tammy. Tori, last word for you.
Super quick. So yes, in resolving the conflict with allies, especially with Korea, definitely optimistic that something will happen that will be beneficial, mutually beneficial. No, in terms of a solution that brings this bill into compliance with our commitments. So that's going to be a continual problem. Maybe in what this means for the future of working with our allies, because clearly we didn't have forethought in this scenario, and we haven't had forethought in several scenarios where we have offended our allies. So maybe, hopefully we'll learn our lesson finally to consult our allies first.
A highly measured answer. Thank you to all of our participants. Thank you to everybody for watching, for sending in your comments and questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions, but please stay tuned to the Wilson Center for more programming like this. It's been a great discussion today. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to our AB crew for helping us get through the issues that we had earlier on. And I wish everybody happy holidays. Thanks.